Guillermo del Toro has talked about how his new film version of Frankenstein was partly inspired by, or at least he very much admires, Kenneth Branagh's 1994 film Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which up to now has been the most faithful adaptation of the book, and del Toro also wanted to produce a reasonably faithful adaptation of the book. So, over the weekend I have somehow managed to watch not only del Toro's new film, but the Kenneth Branagh one as well. So, which one is more faithful to the book? If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover spooky stuff and also myth, legend and folklore more broadly. Quick warning before I get started, spoiler alert, I will be talking about the novel, about both movies, about who dies and how and what they change and all the details. So if you haven't seen one or both of the movies or you haven't read the book, then just maybe step away now if you don't want to be spoiled. Neither adaptation is completely faithful, and that's to be expected. No film adaptation of a book is ever going to be completely faithful to the book. People are always going to make changes and adaptations. Film is a different medium than a book, and you cannot just put a book on film. I think the closest anything has got to just the book on screen is probably the BBC 1995 Pride and Prejudice, but one of the main added sequences to that was Mr. Darcy coming out of the lake in a wet shirt, and I think we can all agree that that was a good addition. So, neither film is going to completely just reproduce the book. Both of them are more faithful than most of the other dozens and dozens and dozens of versions of Frankenstein. As I talked about in the video I put up on Saturday, the 1931 film Frankenstein is really quite far from the book. The 1935 sequel Bride of Frankenstein does adapt the book, but it's also working with the 1931 film, so it's still got quite a few changes, and then the pop culture idea of Frankenstein is really quite different from the book. In that video, I talked about how much about Frankenstein, both the character of the monster, less so the character of Victor, but also the kind of events of the novel really surprised me. It's not what I was expecting because I was not familiar with these more faithful versions and hadn't read the book. And all of the things that really surprised me, most of them are in these two films. Perhaps the biggest thing that still isn't quite in either del Toro's or Branagh's films is, although the creature learns to read and write in both films, he never quite reaches the level of eloquence that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley says the creature has after he has learned to read and write from spying on people in a cottage. Partly that's because in del Toro's version, at least, instead of the creature learning from these people living in a cottage teaching an adult who doesn't read and write French how to read and write French, they're teaching a child. But it's really an artistic choice that the creature does speak, and he does speak pretty well. You know, he speaks proper, I mean, it's English, both films are in English. Del Toro has some other languages in there, but they mostly speak English. But it's really an artistic choice. He never quite reaches the level of persuasive elegance and eloquence that Shelley describes. So far, the version of Frankenstein's monster that I have seen that is the most eloquent is still Rory Kinnear in Penny Dreadful. But both films do include the sequence with the old blind man in the cottage and his family. The family members vary slightly, and the creature learning to speak and read and write from that, although they both also show clear influence of Bride of Frankenstein. At least one of them, he says, friend, quite prominently. I think that was del Toro's. Let me check my notes. Yeah, del Toro's creature says kind of friends in a way very similar to the 1935 Bride of Frankenstein film. Both films also have the framing sequence in the Arctic with the sea captain. For some reason, del Toro has changed the nationality of the ship and the sea captain to Danish instead of English. Branagh has kept them as, I think they're meant to be English. Kenneth Branagh likes to cast movies with people with a wide variety of different accents, and then nobody fakes an accent, ever. They just speak in their own accents. And he does the same here. So they sound kind of American, but I think they're meant to be English. But either way, the ship's captain who's trying to get to the North Pole and who finds Victor and picks him up and rescues him in the Arctic while Victor is chasing the creature, and that's the framing device for the story. Both of these films have that, which means they both also include a really core part of the ending of Mary Shelley's novel, which is that the person who is saved in all of this is the captain, Walton, and his crew, because Walton, or whatever he's called in Del Toro's version, is trying to get to the North Pole, and it's really, really dangerous, and he's likely going to kill himself and all his crew desperately just want to go home, and they're in trouble. And talking to Victor Frankenstein about his obsession with his creature and how it destroyed his entire life and everybody he loved is what prompts Walton to turn around and to save himself and his crew and not drive them all to destruction trying to find the North Pole, which is his particular obsession. So both movies include that and include that aspect of the ending and the conclusion of the story, which is really nice. Both movies also change some things. The level of changes and the things they change are a bit different. Del Toro has talked about how much he liked Steph Lady and Frank Darabont's script for Branagh's film. Branagh usually writes and directs, but in this case it was Frank Darabont of Shawshank Redemption fame and Steph Lady who wrote the screenplay, and Branagh was the director. And Del Toro really admired that film and that script, and one of the key things that he also does, and I suspect other adaptations have as well over the years, is Victor Frankenstein's mother dies giving birth to his brother William rather than of a fever several years later. You can see the attraction of this idea because Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died a few days after giving birth to Mary Shelley. Now, she actually didn't write that into her book. She did write the mother dying, and the loss of the mother is important to Victor Frankenstein and his character and his family. She just had her die of a fever. She wasn't as on the nose with it, I guess. Also, the way that poor real-life Mary Wollstonecraft died was not as dramatic or thematically kind of useful as what they do in the films. Del Toro's film doesn't really specify exactly how the mothers died, so it could be the same. Branagh's film has the most overblown childbirth scene I've ever seen. He's got this huge set and there's blood everywhere, and for some reason Ian Holm, who's playing the father, who is also a doctor, who is also supervising the birth, is like half naked, and it's all a bit strange. It's this terribly dramatic sequence with the mother yelling at her husband to cut the baby out to save the baby. Now, a caesarean section up until the modern period it wasn't something the mother usually survived. The baby might survive 10 to 20% of the time. It was a way to try and save the baby, but it was a last-ditch attempt to try and save the baby. It was something you would do if the mother was going to die. It's not something people were doing, and I think I wrote about this when I wrote about House of the Dragon for Den of Geek a little while back. It's not something people are doing to sacrifice the mother's life for the baby. They're both going to die, and if we do this, there is an outside chance we might save the baby, a very small chance. Also, in earlier times, the medieval period, it was an opportunity to baptize the baby as well. So that is really more of a movie representation of this kind of thing. Also, Mary Wollstonecraft did not die because of a caesarean section, although it was not dissimilar. The placenta got stuck, the doctor pulled it out, and he hadn't washed his hands, and she got an infection. So both movies can't resist playing with Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft's real history, and altering the reason for the death of the mother, and also tying the death of the mother to the birth of William, because William, of course, is a very important character, and his death is very important in the story, although they end up going different directions with that. Both films also add a bunch of stuff. Frankenstein is quite a long novel, but I suppose it's also quite introspective. There's a lot of travel, which interestingly the films always cut down. I think the pacing of the novel is something that is felt would not quite work for a 2 or 2.5 hour film. Branagh's is 2 hours, Del Toro's is 2.5. I think if you did it as a TV series, you could go closer to the details of the plot of the novel in terms of the travel and the amount of time everything takes. If you're spreading it out and making episodes, then that's pretty typical. You know, films work really well adapted from short stories. Novels work really well adapted into TV series because they are longer and they are in chapters. But if you are making a film from a novel, then you have to usually make some changes because of the pacing. So the pacing in both is different, and they've had to make plot changes for that reason. Another interesting thing that both films do is spend more time on the creation of the creature and then less time on some of the later stuff. They kind of rush through, or not rush through, but both films, particularly the whole kind of sequence with the creature demanding that Victor Frankenstein make him a bride. And then in the book, this is a really, really long sequence where he goes to England, he goes to London, then he goes up to Scotland, then he goes to the Orkneys, and he starts making the bride. And then he starts to worry that the bride is going to be as violent as the creature, or they'll hate each other, and that he's going to unleash this awfulness on the world. And then he tells the creature he won't make the bride after all, and dumps the bits of what he'd been making into the sea. And it's quite a long sequence. In Del Toro's film, the creature makes the demand and Victor just says no. And it's just done very quickly that way. And then he's doing very different things with the character of Elizabeth. In Branagh's film, with the Steph Lady Frank Darabont screenplay, they go quite a different direction as well, because they've speeded up this section. There's a character called Justine who is included in Branagh's film, who often gets cut altogether, but she is executed wrongfully for the murder of Victor's brother William. And in Branagh's film, the creature actually wants Victor to make the bride out of Justine's body, and that's why he says no. But then there's a whole sequence after the creature has killed his wife Elizabeth where he tries to raise Elizabeth for himself rather than for the creature. He chops off her head and attaches it to Justine's body, which is interesting because when Mary Shelley was writing, people were only just starting to think of the brain as the kind of source of personality. Nowadays, we often think of the brain as the source of the personality. It's where thoughts come from. There's the whole concept of brains in a jar, and that only works if the brain is the core part of personality as opposed to the rest of the body. In the past, that wasn't always the case. People have thought the liver was the source of kind of personality at various points, sometimes the heart. There's been quite a bit of variation. So when Mary Shelley was writing, people were starting to decide it was the brain, but the idea that the brain is the personality, and if you cut off Elizabeth's head and put it on Justine's body, it will be Elizabeth, is possibly a slightly more modern idea. I've noticed a lot of the modern interpretations from 1931 onwards, modern being not 19th century, are really interested in the idea that the creature, and if there is one, the bride, might remember something from the lives of the people whose bodies are making them up. The bride is usually more one body, albeit still with some stitching. I mean, she's obviously a dead body, so still with some work done. The creature is usually lots of different bodies, and I talked a bit in my previous video about the fact that the book isn't very specific about that, though there is a root of it in at least Mary Shelley's introduction to the book, if not the book itself. But a lot of modern versions, starting with 1931, work on the idea that there is something about the people who have been put together to make the creature that maybe survives in the creature. So in 1931, in the movie, the creature had the brain of a murderer, and that's what makes him so violent. In Branagh's version, the brain is from one of Victor's teachers and is like the best brain, but the bulk of the body comes from the man who murdered the teacher. There's a whole subplot with a cholera epidemic and people not wanting to get vaccinated, which actually feels slightly more relevant now than it probably did in 1994, although there was a vaccination crisis in the 90s as well. But the body is mostly from this murderer, and that kind of feeds into the creature being violent. There's obviously an assumption when he tries to raise Elizabeth that there's clearly something of Elizabeth in there. This is also where Del Toro's version gets the idea of the creature when he first awakens just saying Victor, because when he raises Elizabeth, Victor keeps saying, say my name, say my name, say my name, and she just about manages it. Penny Dreadful does this as well, and it seems to be a general theme. Del Toro's version, the creature talks about kind of the body remembering, and none of this is really in the book. The creature in the book is more almost like a newborn, not quite like a newborn because he's able to survive on his own. So I guess there is an implication of some kind of adult memory in there, because otherwise the creature wouldn't survive when Victor just often abandons him. So I guess, yeah, not entirely. There is an implication there of some kind of memory. But Mary Shelley is less interested in the idea of the creature remembering kind of bits of what was in the bodies. She does talk about kind of bits from charnel houses, which could be the bodies of executed criminals, which is shown in Del Toro's version, I think also in Branagh's, and does make sense. Yeah, both versions. It's bits of bodies of executed criminals. And there is a sort of an implication in the text that that might be what's happening. But she doesn't really dwell on it. And there's a lot more emphasis on rejection as the source of the creature's violence, which I shall come back to shortly. Overall, though, in terms of the plot, Branagh's film is clearly much closer to the plot of the novel than Del Toro's film. Although Branagh's film does make various changes and add things, especially the sequence with Elizabeth at the end, it is much more faithful. It is much closer to the plot of the novel. There's superficial ways in which it's obviously closer. Branagh's film is set in the time period the novel is set, which is the late 1700s. The novel was written starting in 1816. It was published in 3 different editions, 1818, 1823, 1831, but it is set in the late 1700s. There are letters in the framing device that are dated 17 blank. This is very common in novels of this period, that you blank out specifics. I think partly so people can't nitpick, and partly so that you can't be accused of libeling anybody. So specific names, places and dates might have this kind of blank, but it's 17 blank. So Mary Shelley set her novel at the end of the 18th century, not in the 19th century. That is Branagh's setting. Guillermo del Toro's movie is set much, much later, in the mid-19th century, after Mary Shelley herself had died. So it is a much later setting. Del Toro's film also has deliberately not entirely accurate costuming. This is not kind of a criticism of him or the costume designer for doing it wrong, because they are clearly doing it on purpose. The costumes are not meant to be completely accurate to the mid-19th century. It's an artistic choice. In Branagh's film, I am not an expert on 18th century clothing, but to my untrained eye, relatively untrained eye, they look pretty close. I think Helena Bonham Carter's hair is probably a little bit madder, maybe. This is the beginning of Helena Bonham Carter's creepy characters. This is 1994, and she was known for playing the ingenue in period dramas. She was like trapped in period dramas for some reason. But she was playing like rebellious but young girls. She'd also played Ophelia in the Franco Zeffirelli production of Hamlet. She was not in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, presumably because she'd already done it a couple of years earlier. But she has the beginnings of that hair that she has in many movies since then. And of course, when she plays the reanimated corpse, it's a very early kind of gothic Helena Bonham Carter role before she ended up with Tim Burton some years later. She was in a relationship with Branagh for 6 years. One of the reasons I've avoided this movie is because Kenneth Branagh cheated on Emma Thompson while they were making it, and that's an unforgivable crime. But yeah, they were together for a few years. This is pre-Tim Burton and pre all the kind of gothic stuff that she's very much known for now. And the plot of Branagh's film is reasonably close to the book. The character of Justine's mother, Mrs. Moritz, is a bit more of a film character, but Justine, who usually gets cut but does appear in this one, who is wrongfully killed for the murder of William, who's a kind of servant slash friend. Elizabeth, who's raised with the Frankensteins as their sister, but then they're not actually blood relatives, and she and Victor get married. She's the same. William is a child. Del Toro ages William up. Victor's younger brother, the father, the mother who dies young, it's all kind of there. Henry Clerval, Victor's best friend, his death is different because of the cutting down of the later sections. So Henry's death happens later. Henry survives slightly longer in the film than he does in the book. But he is killed by the creature. He is Victor's friend. And there's minor things like Elizabeth going to Ingolstadt to try and convince Victor to stop working on the creature and stuff like that. But overall, the plot of Branagh's film is not a million miles from the book. It is recognisably the plot of the book with some changes. Del Toro's film is a lot more different, as well as the superficial changes to the time period and the deliberately kind of anachronistic costuming. There's also a lot of changes to characters and relationships. Elizabeth is engaged to William in this version, and William is an adult. William in the book is most definitely a child. Henry Clerval isn't in it. There's this new kind of mentor character played by Christoph Waltz, who I think might be inspired by Dr. Pretorius from the film Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. And the shape of the plot itself is really quite different. It's got the Arctic and the sea captain framing device. It's got the sequence with the old blind man in the cottage. Those are pretty book accurate, but kind of most of the rest is not really like the book. Victor also studies in Edinburgh instead of Ingolstadt, which I thought was maybe a bit of a reference to the famous resurrection men who dug up bodies for doctors to examine from Edinburgh. A bit of a reference to Mary Shelley, who lived not far from Edinburgh for a long time and was very fond of Scotland. And also an excuse to have them speak English, because Del Toro does make use of other languages at points in the film. The Danish crew speak Danish, and Victor and his mother speak French. They're Swiss, and that is their native language in the book. So Edinburgh gives him a reason for everyone to speak English. He's also talked about wanting to set it in the time period of the Crimean War. They actually go out and get dead bodies from the war at one point in this version. And there's this kind of tower where Victor does the creating of the creature, which is also probably somewhat inspired by the windmill from the 1931 film. So the development of the plot, the relationships of the characters, there's a lot more changes to these kind of core elements of the story in Del Toro's version than there are in Branagh's. But what really matters, and what really makes Branagh's version ultimately more faithful not only to the plot of the book, but to the spirit of the book, is the themes and the reason that the creature is violent. As I mentioned in my other video, there's this well-known saying that knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein is not the monster, and wisdom is knowing that he is. The idea that Victor Frankenstein, the creator, is the monster of the book is pretty well rehearsed. And Del Toro takes that and really, really, really runs with it. I do think he's inspired as much by the 1935 film Bride of Frankenstein as anything else, because the creature is rather more like the creature's depiction there. And the reason for the violence, well, there's two very, very key changes in Del Toro's movie that completely change some of the themes of the book. He makes Victor Frankenstein kind of inarguably the monster of the story, far more so than the creature, because the creature in Del Toro's version hardly kills anybody. He kills William kind of in self-defense, and William is an adult, not a child. Not that I'm saying it's okay to kill adults. Don't murder kids, it's bad. But there is an emotional gut wrench to the death of a young boy that is different when it's the death of an adult who's then kind of mean as he's dying. That changes the tone of that, and it is kind of almost self-defense. And then the mentor figure is kind of killed in a scuffle with Victor, and Victor kills Elizabeth by accident, shooting at the creature and shooting her instead. It's like a Dr. Horrible moment. And so the creature in this version, I don't think, apart from William in this kind of moment of self-defense, I don't think the creature kills anybody. Oh, he does kill people on the ship. The creature in Del Toro's version does murder 6 men on the ship at the beginning, which is odd because then he kills hardly anybody else. Half the point of the book is that they are both monstrous. Victor is playing God, and he has become obsessed with his work to the point of neglecting his family, and that neglect then becomes the death of all of them because the creature, and he has also neglected the creature. Victor's biggest crime is neglect. He neglects his family and friends to build the creature, and then he neglects the creature once he's made him, and that rejection is what turns the creature to violence. The creature murders William deliberately and with premeditation because he wants vengeance for Victor leaving him, for Victor abandoning him. Which he doesn't even do as quickly in the Del Toro version. He actually spends ages kind of at one point kind of trying to look after the creature, and he's really rude about it, and the creature is like not intelligent enough for him, and like he's a terrible parent. But this is the thing, Del Toro's version makes it more like a cycle of abuse, because another change Del Toro has made is that the father, Daddy Frankenstein, played by Charles Dance, is abusive. He hates Victor and his mother. He does dote on William, but he's abusive towards Victor and his mother. And then Victor carries on that cycle of abuse by being dismissive and abusive toward the creature. And he is clearly physically and verbally abusing the creature, who is his son, as it were. So that is a very strong theme in Del Toro's version, that it is this cycle of abuse that is perpetuating this violence, and then the creature kind of breaks it at the end when Victor dies, and they actually reconcile before Victor dies. In the novel, there is no final confrontation, which was a bit of a letdown, I'm not going to lie, but there is no final confrontation. The creature comes along after Victor has died, and then just goes off to the North Pole to die. Branagh's version did that in a relatively faithful but slightly more satisfying way, as they have the creature dramatically immolating himself on Victor's funeral pyre, which kind of keeps the spirit of the book, but in a slightly more dramatically satisfying way. But Del Toro's version, making all these changes, changes the themes, whereas Branagh's version sticks to the basic idea of the novel, which, yes, man playing God and Victor becoming monstrous himself is a theme of the novel, but more than that, the point of the novel is that it was rejection and neglect that kind of made the creature violent. Now, obviously, we all have a choice, and you can be rejected or neglected and not murder people. Again, I want to quote Jake from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, cool motive, still murder. So Shelley is not saying that everybody who is neglected or lacks love or is rejected is going to go off and be a murderer. But the point is, that is what drives the creature to the despair that makes him violent. It's rejection and neglect and a lack of love. That's why he wants Victor to make him a bride. And that is completely lost in Del Toro's version, where the creature is way nicer, apart from this bit at the beginning where he murders a bunch of sailors. Other than that, the creature's way nicer. Frankenstein's much worse. More of the death that happens is Victor's fault, not the creature's. He has this relationship with Elizabeth where she is kind of very affectionate towards him and loving towards him, and then he kind of carries her off, but he doesn't try and reanimate her at all. He carries Elizabeth off, and I'm thinking, is he going to try and make her his bride because she's just been killed? And actually, of course, in the Branagh version, Victor tries to make her his bride. Well, he tries to reanimate her and make her his bride again after she's been killed. But no, the creature just leaves Elizabeth, carries off her body, but then leaves her. Basically, the creature has been made like super nice. Victor has been made into a complete monster. Victor in the book and in the Branagh version is well-intentioned. He does run off and abandon the creature. That is his big kind of crime, as it were. But Victor loves his friends and family. He's neglected them because he became obsessed with his work, and that was his big fatal flaw. But he loves his family, and he's not abusive, he's not violent. His only act of abuse is to abandon the creature, and that is the act that condemns him and his entire family. But he's not monstrous in that way. It's nothing like as obvious a way of being monstrous. And he also tries to improve over the course of the novel and tries to think more of other people and care more about other people. It's kind of too late. I did find Del Toro's kind of what the movie did with Elizabeth a bit odd, interesting. I mean, in a story, as a story by itself, it was an interesting story. It's so different from the book. it kind of reminded me of, ironically, Francis Ford Coppola was a producer on the Kenneth Branagh Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and he had made, in 1992, Bram Stoker's Dracula. You can see the theme. They were aiming for, this is a more accurate adaptation. And one of the things Bram Stoker's Dracula does is play up a romantic connection between Mina and Dracula that simply is not in the book. In the book, Dracula is monstrous and Mina is not attracted to him. And Del Toro's film was kind of doing something similar with Elizabeth and the creature, and it was an interesting story and it was an interesting way to go with it. I do find it kind of slightly strange how modern adaptations keep wanting to do this like Beauty and the Beast, the female character falling for the creature thing. I've never been as fond of the stories Beauty and the Beast as a lot of people are, so I don't know if that's why it just kind of slightly rubs me up the wrong way. It's not in the novels. Although, of course, Del Toro's creature is also less violent and murdery, so that's a factor. One thing I will say for Del Toro's version is it's a more watchable or rewatchable movie for me personally. Not because it's better. I think both movies are very, very good. Kenneth Branagh is one of my favourite writer-directors. I love his films. This was one of a few, very small number of his films I haven't already seen. I think both movies are really, really good movies. Because Branagh's version is closer to the novel, that means that some of the most gut-wrenching parts of the novel are in there. So the murder of William and Helen Bonham Carter coming out, crying that she's found him and she's found his body is just absolutely gut-wrenching. And then, the murders of everybody else and the tragedy of this story is, full front and centre in Branagh's version because it is a relatively faithful adaptation of the novel. The Del Toro version is less gut-wrenchingly upsetting because everybody except poor Elizabeth is quite flawed. Christoph Waltz's character is interesting. It's kind of his own fault. He ends up dying slightly quicker than he was anyway. William you feel sorry for, but he is an adult, and then as he's dying, he's kind of mean to Victor. So, yeah, it's sad, but it's nothing like the horrific tragedy of the novel and the Branagh movie. And he hasn't been murdered by the creature for vengeance. He's been killed by the creature in like a violent scuffle, which is not quite the same thing. Elizabeth has been shot by Victor, which is tragic in a different way and obviously terribly sad. But they've got this whole love triangle thing going on with her being engaged to William, not Victor, and then he's not really aiming for her. It's an accident. He's trying to shoot the creature. And it's very sad, but it's not, for me personally, it doesn't get to like really deep horror the way the Branagh one does. But it means I would be more up for rewatching it. Not because Branagh's movie is bad, but because it's good. Del Toro's also has this more cathartic ending. Del Toro's creature is like a superhero. He can't die. He can't destroy himself with fire or explosions or anything. He cannot kind of die. And he also has this super healing power. He's like Deadpool. At the end of Del Toro's movie, he actually does a superhero thing. He frees the ship from the ice himself. So he has this kind of superhero aspect to him that is not usual, is not in other versions. And he has this cathartic reconciliation with Victor, and they kind of make peace, and then the creature just sort of walks off into the Arctic. Whereas Branagh's follows the novel more closely, slightly more dramatically, but same basic idea of they never have this confrontation, and then the creature destroys himself, because in Branagh's version they can do so, and Elizabeth destroys herself with fire, and then so does the creature. So he gets kind of an ending, but he never gets to reconcile with Victor, more like the novel. So I think Del Toro's film is a less kind of upsetting experience to watch. I think they are equally good films, but it's absolutely safe to say that if you were to ask which film is the more faithful adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, that is definitely, easily still Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1994. Del Toro's takes elements of the novel that don't always make it into adaptations, but honestly, not even all that many. The themes are different. There's one theme that's absolutely hammered home with the subtlety of an anvil, and the other themes of the book are simply not there. The plot's been changed, the characters have been changed, the setting's been changed. Actually, Del Toro's film is really quite far from the book, and the sea captain's nationality is different for no apparent reason. It's really not a particularly faithful to the book adaptation. That doesn't mean it's bad. There is nothing wrong with an adaptation that goes a different direction. It's an adaptation. It's okay to do that. It's a very good film, but it is not faithful to the book. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, subscribe to my channel for spooky stuff, history, myth, folklore, ghost stories in particular. If you would like to support the channel, please do consider buying one of my books. Ooh. Or if you know anybody who likes ghost stories and you need a Christmas present, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, Ancient Greece, and Haunting Tales for Winter. This one is Haunted Christmases, going back in time from the Regency period through Reformation Scotland, medieval France, and all the way back to Viking Age Iceland. So if you know anyone who likes ghost stories, it might make a good Christmas present. They're available paperback or ebook, or if you want something to read over Christmas yourself. Do let me know if you like seeing me do these kind of book to film comparisons, and I will happily do more of them next year. And until next time, bye! Boy.